Hello everybody. In this week's video we're going to be learning about the progressive presidents, Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, and also the less famous William Howard Taft. Here are your video goals. You will notice that there are many vocabulary words. Make sure you pay attention to those and have at least a short definition for each one of those, because you might get quizzed on them. Alright, let's start by talking about Teddy Roosevelt, who is seen as the first progressive president. And what's interesting about Teddy Roosevelt is originally he is not elected. In fact, he takes over as president when President William McKinley is assassinated. He was vice president and had been vice president for like around a year and took over in 1901. And he takes over as the youngest man to ever be president. His record still holds. He takes over at the age of 42. And McKinley was kind of a conservative, but Roosevelt is very much a progressive. And he proposes a new plan called the Square Deal. And the basic idea of Teddy Roosevelt's Square Deal is to make life fair again for average Americans. There are lots of problems coming out of the Gilded Age with inequality, and Teddy Roosevelt wants to address these problems, and he's going to do so using the power of the government. The first thing that he wants to do is he wants to control the power of big business. So we've talked a lot about big business and monopolies. And basically, by the time Teddy Roosevelt comes into power in 1901, the monopolies are still in place. They still dominate American economics. And Teddy Roosevelt sets out to change this. And he does this in a couple of ways. One, he changes the way old laws are being applied. The Sherman Antitrust Act, which was passed back in the 1890s, is now applied with full force. And Teddy Roosevelt uses this law to bring down some of the biggest monopolies in the country. He also starts to back up labor unions. Up until this point, the government usually fought labor unions and backed up big business, but not anymore. Teddy Roosevelt uses the power of the government to support labor unions and their right to strike for a better deal. And there are some pretty famous examples of this that happened during his first term in office. The first is his use of the Sherman Antitrust Act to break up Northern securities. So this was a giant monopoly that was being set up by a banker called J.P. Morgan. And this monopoly was going to control all the railroads in the western part of the country, and this would have allowed them to charge super high prices. Anyway, Roosevelt figures this out, and he has his people use the Sherman Act to break up this railroad monopoly. And yeah, this is one of the first times that a giant company has been faced down by the government, but it won't be the last. Over the course of his presidency, Roosevelt will take down over 40 monopolies, and that's just the beginning. And this earned Roosevelt the reputation of being a giant slayer, and you can see the picture there of Teddy Roosevelt taking on the giant monopolies. Also, Teddy Roosevelt uses his power to back up unions. There's a big strike in Pennsylvania when coal miners say that they don't want to keep working, they want higher wages, they want shorter hours. Teddy Roosevelt decides to let it play out. The big coal companies ask for government assistance. Instead, Teddy Roosevelt says if they don't make a deal with the coal miners, he's going to send the troops in and take over the mines. So anyway, because of Teddy Roosevelt's efforts, he's able to get better treatment for workers, and he's able to increase the government control over the economy. He's able to take some power away from big business. Another thing that's really important that Teddy Roosevelt does is he starts to pass laws in order to protect American consumers. And he was heavily influenced in this by the work of the muckrakers, especially Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. So after he read The Jungle, apparently Teddy Roosevelt was sick to his stomach. And he said, quote, that radical action must be taken to do away with the efforts of arrogant and selfish greed on the part of the capitalist. Basically saying that they needed to work to make sure that the big business owners didn't just do whatever they took to get money. And so, in order to improve the quality of the products and to protect consumers, Teddy Roosevelt signs into law a couple of acts that allow the government to regulate products. The first one, having to do specifically with slaughterhouses, is called the Meat Inspection Act. And what this does is it says that the government is going to go in and inspect slaughterhouses to make sure that they are clean and to make sure that they don't mislabel products, that you can't grind up a bunch of rats and cats and call it beef, right? Right. Also, they pass another law called the Pure Food and Drug Act, which ensures that the food and the drugs that are shipped around the country are both pure and what they say they are. It's very important that drugs that are shipped across straight lines are actually the drugs that they say they are and not some sort of imitation product. Also, so all of this adds up to a new and important role for government. It used to be that businesses could just say whatever they wanted and label their products whatever they wanted. But not anymore. Now the government makes sure that that companies are actually selling the products they say they're selling. And lastly, and maybe one of Roosevelt's most famous and long-lasting accomplishments, was his effort to conserve the American wilderness. And he did this by using a law that was passed in 1890 called the Forest Reserve Act. And the idea here was that the president was allowed to declare certain parts of the country as national forests or national parks. And the reason that this law was created was to make sure that the United States didn't just chop down all of its trees. A country needs to make sure that it has stuff for the future, and in order to do this, certain parts of the country, certain giant chunks of forest were set off limits to make sure that companies or individual lumberjacks didn't just go in and clear cut the forest for a quick buck. And so the idea here was that we were going to rationally manage a resource that we all depend on. And so Roosevelt takes this law and he uses it to preserve 125 million acres of forest. That is about as much land as the entire state of California. He takes that and he says, all of this stuff is off limits. No logging, no building. And he creates a system of national parks. And these parks not only protect national forests for later use, but they also lead to the rise of an environmental movement, where people believe that the environment is valuable in itself, that we should not just chop down trees whenever it's easy to make some money off of them. The most famous park created is Yosemite National Park, which you can see there. It's about 3 or 4 hours outside of San Francisco in California, and it's some of the most famous mountains and hiking and rock climbing in the world. You can still go there today and it looks just like that. So anyway, Teddy Roosevelt is very successful and he has a lot of great accomplishments. And he is president for about 7 years. After he becomes president from being vice president, he runs for office and is elected again. He could have run for a third term, but he decides not to. And so he steps down and endorses William Howard Taft, who was his Secretary of War. So anyway, Taft promises to keep doing Roosevelt's work, and he wins the election no problem. And he continues smashing trusts. Over his 4 years in office, he breaks up 90 trusts, or at least tries to break up 90 trusts, which is 50 more than Roosevelt did in 7 years. However, Taft decides, as he's going through his presidency, to break with Roosevelt on a couple of issues. One is that he decides not to lower the tariff, which he promised he would, and he fires the head of the National Forest Service, a guy that Roosevelt really liked. And because of this, Roosevelt decides that William Howard Taft doesn't know what he's doing, and Roosevelt runs for president again in 1912, which leads to a very wacky election. The election of 1912 is a three-way race. It's between a Republican nominee, William Howard Taft, and the Democratic candidate, a guy named Woodrow Wilson. But it's complicated because Teddy Roosevelt also runs as a third party. He starts a party called the Progressive Party, which is like the Republican Party but more progressive. And he calls this party the Bull Moose Party. So anyway, what you get is the Republicans splitting their votes between Taft and Roosevelt, which leads, as this cartoon shows, to a Democratic victory. Woodrow Wilson riding in on his donkey. So anyway, the two main parties here are really Roosevelt and Wilson. Taft is kind of definitely going to lose. So it's a choice between two types of progressivism. One is Roosevelt, who calls his progressivism the new nationalism, and Wilson, who is also a progressive, and he calls for something called the new freedom. And it's important to compare and contrast these two different views on what the government should do. So the election of 1912 was a choice between two types of progressivism. One was Teddy Roosevelt's, quote, new nationalism. And the idea here was to make everything big. We would have big businesses, but these businesses would be controlled by powerful unions and a big, powerful federal government. So the big businesses would be able to keep doing their thing and enjoy all of the efficiencies that you get from having big business, but they would no longer be able to do all the unfair stuff they did because of government regulation and because of unions. Also, Roosevelt called for government-funded insurance, health insurance, unemployment insurance, minimum wage, and women's suffrage. So Roosevelt was really making some very forward-looking, very progressive, almost radical calls. If anybody called for government-funded insurance today, they would immediately be called a socialist. Woodrow Wilson, on the other hand, said that we should tend back towards smaller government. So he said we should break up big businesses, that way they're not as powerful, and that instead we should help small farmers and small businesses. And then all the government should do is pass laws to make sure that competition is fair, to prevent new monopolies from rising up. So you kind of have a choice between a bigness on Roosevelt's part and a new smallness on Wilson's part. So anyway, the election of 1912 is a landslide victory for the Democrats. Because Roosevelt and Taft split the Republican vote, Wilson won almost every single state. It was one of the most one-sided elections in U.S. history. So Roosevelt kind of destroyed his own party by running against William Howard Taft. So now let's look at what Wilson does with his time in office. Woodrow Wilson is a pretty interesting dude. For most of his life, he was not a politician. In fact, he was a professor at a university. He studied history. And he then became the president of Princeton University, a very prestigious university in New Jersey. He was a man of ideas. He studied history, he studied philosophy, and he had very strong ideas about what was right and what was wrong. This made him at once a very powerful politician because he had very clear ideas and he was very good at expressing himself, but also very inflexible at times because he refused to compromise on issues that he thought were clear matters of right or wrong. Anyway, he ended up getting into politics later in his life when he became the governor of New Jersey, and he was able to pass a number of progressive reforms. And in 1912, when he becomes president, he declares as his main goal, quote, demolishing the triple wall of privilege. He wants to get rid of these forces in society that lead to inequality. He wants especially to get rid of monopolies, tariffs, and banks. And he's by and large successful at all three of these things. So the first, quote, wall of privilege are the monopolies. The problem here is that even though William Howard Taft and Teddy Roosevelt broke up a bunch of trusts, there are still a lot of trusts out there. And the reason for this is that the law that Teddy Roosevelt and Taft were using was flawed. The Sherman Antitrust Act had a bunch of loopholes. First of all, certain monopolies were immune from the Sherman Antitrust Act. It just didn't give the government enough power to go after these monopolies. Second, the Sherman Antitrust Act was actually being used by some conservative politicians to break up labor unions. They claimed that labor unions, by getting everybody who did a single job into a single union, created a monopoly on labor. And by breaking up labor unions, they were putting more power back into the hands of big business. So what Woodrow Wilson does is he gets Congress to pass a new law called the Clayton Antitrust Act. And this Antitrust Act allows labor unions to legally organize, and it provides new ways to go after big business. And so with this law in place, Wilson is able to go on and break up even more of the monopolies. Second, wall number two is the tariff. So up until Wilson, there had been about 20 years of super high tariffs. Beginning with the McKinley Tariff in 1890, tariff rates were around 50%. What that meant is if something came in for $1 from England or France or China, it would be sold in the United States for $1.50, and the United States would keep that 50% profit. This meant that the government got a lot of money, but it also meant that big businesses in America could sell their products for more. And what this meant is that big business was very powerful and that normal average Americans were paying a lot more for their stuff. So what Wilson does is he passes the Underwood Tariff. And what this does is that it lowers the tariff. And you can see on this chart here that it brings the tariff down from around 40% to 28%, which is a big decrease. But there's a new problem, and that is that a lower tariff means less money for the United States. And the solution for this is revolutionary. Wilson says that to make up for all of the lost tax money, rich people in the United States are going to pay an income tax. Anybody who makes more than $3,000 a year, which was a lot back then, now has to pay some of the money they make to the government. As a result of this, the tax burden is shifted from the poor to the rich. Rich people are now paying more taxes and poor people are paying less taxes. Also, stuff is now cheaper. The average person is paying less for their stuff, and the average rich person is paying more money in taxes. And third is banks. So one of the big problems that in the United States was that the banking system was controlled by a bunch of a small number of very powerful banks, most of them located in New York City. And what this meant is that the banks had a huge amount of power to control how the American government functioned. To fix this, Wilson signs into law the Federal Reserve Act. And what this does is it gives the government greater control over the banking system. And this allows the United States government to control interest rates, which is how much money you have to pay on loans. And it allows the government to control the supply of paper money, which means that you now have some power over inflation or deflation. So we'll talk more about this in class, but basically inflation can help the economy sometimes and hurt the economy other times. And now the government has control over this instead of the banks. So basically this just gives the United States more power and takes power away from big business and banks. And so let's just take a minute now to zoom out and think about the accomplishments of the progressive presidents. So basically what happens during the progressive era under these presidents is that the power of the government is greatly expanded. The government can do way more now to control the economy and to control business than ever before. Monopolies and banks no longer dominate the economy because they are now controlled by the United States. There's that political cartoon there shows skinny Woodrow Wilson ready to do battle with trusts and tariffs. And by and large, he is successful. Labor unions are now more powerful, and they are able to fight for better pay. Public land is protected, and we now have a system of national parks. And life is a little bit harder for big businessmen and for wealthy people, but a little bit better for the working classes thanks to the laws that are passed.